Welcome back to the channel. Today's story comes from Redditor WorldAwayTweedy. If you enjoy their work, be sure to check out their profile for more amazing stories. Their link is in the description below. Now, let's dive in. It was a Thursday when God revealed himself to all of humanity. The day started ordinary enough, but sometime in the afternoon, I felt a presence in my chest and a voice in my ear. "I have returned," the voice said. As it just so happened that everyone had heard that voice, everyone felt that presence, and soon everyone stepped out of their dwellings and looked up at the sky and saw the clouds disappear and a brilliant light shine for just an instant, a moment, a light so brilliant it couldn't have belonged to the sun, and it had to have been something else. And it was clear. The feeling in our hearts was certain. The Lord was real, and he was here. What happened next was likely what you would have expected. The world became kinder, more compassionate. Not by virtue of an intrinsic force of goodness overtaking us, but rather the fear of retribution. You didn't want to fight, didn't want to insult, didn't want to judge, because you didn't know what would happen when you did. A safe life, with the recent supernatural developments, was one that contained a bit more charity, a bit more turning the other cheek, and a bit more feigned grace. Fake it till you make it, after all. I watched for signs of what would change next. We were all under the watchful eye, but at least felt, incorrectly we would realize, that the Almighty's interventions had been minimal so far. Everyone found out at their own pace that death had become a thing of the past. Some knew immediately, when their loved ones in hospice care saw remarkable turnarounds in health. Others missed the memo until mass consensus had been established, when scientists and statisticians alike revealed that by every known metric, natural disasters, car crashes, heart attacks, that the number of daily reported deaths had plummeted from an average of 160,000 to 0. Life went on, and as it did, I started hearing whispers of what worship was. Depending on who you talked to, online or at the water cooler, you'd hear a different rumor, a different interpretation. It wasn't until my mom was called upon that I knew what it was. I remember it vividly. 7 o'clock, after dinner, Mom got up from her seat in the living room, got ready, donned her coat, stepped towards the shoe rack. "Where you heading, hun?" my father asked her. "I've been summoned." "I'm sorry?" "The Lord has summoned me for worship." I remember just how odd the moment felt. Life had been tinged with a certain unreality since the grand question was blown wide open. Seeing Mom head for the door both did and didn't make any sense. Had it been any other year, we would have thought she was doing a bit. "Did you, need a ride?" my dad asked confusedly. "The Lord would like me to walk," she responded. Then she turned the knob and went outside. I was 17 at the time. My brother was 20. We both asked Dad if we should follow her. He told us to stay home, that he'd accompany her and figure out what was going on. He didn't return until the next evening. We rushed downstairs when we heard the front door open, hoping we'd catch both parents entering. Instead, it was just him. Disheveled, weary, a muted expression on his face. I'll never forget the way he looked at us. "She's standing in a field," he said. Then, "There are other people there too." 4 months passed since Mom was first called to worship. During that time, we learned something more about God's interventions. The new commandments, as I termed them in my brain, were panning out as the following. "Thou shalt not die," via disease, natural disasters, etc. Thou shalt be called to worship at a random time. Now, I'll admit, neither of those are as catchy as the OG commandments. This is, after all, not the official word of the Lord, merely just my reading of the tea leaves. Commandment 3 came to me in a dream. Kidding. It came to me in a YouTube video. It was your usual street fight video. Two guys on a sidewalk corner, for reasons unknown, exchanging blows, until the bigger of the two got the upper hand and started wailing and wailing, then secured a knife and, like a light bulb went off in his head, stopped, lifted himself from his rival. The guy getting his ass handed to him stood up also, and then both of them just walked. Single file, empty expressions on their faces. Manchurian candidate shit. So, if thou attempt to kill another, thou shalt immediately be summoned to worship, was the takeaway. But what, pray tell, was worship really? I visited my mom one afternoon to understand better. The spot she had journeyed to was an hour's drive from home, so she must have trekked for hours that first night. I arrived at the field to the sight of thousands of people standing evenly spaced, 3 feet apart in every direction. They all faced the same way, heads tilted slightly towards the sky, perfectly still. No movement. I maneuvered the rows for what felt like an endless amount of time. When I finally found her, it genuinely felt like I just got lucky. It was my first time seeing her since she'd been gone. I had mentally convinced myself that there was no need for me to come out here. After all, she'd be coming home, any day now. Mom. I'll admit, I was a bit emotional. To my surprise, despite her fixed posture and eyes tilted up, her mouth moved. Hi, sweetheart. How are you? I'm well. I am in worship. She wasn't totally being herself. Mom, are you able to move? I am in worship, she repeated. But do you want to come home? The softness in her tone didn't change, but it did seem like she was imbuing her words with some kind of subtext. Trying to say something more. I can't, love. And then enunciated even clearer. I think you should go home. Perhaps before you're forced to stay too. But home. Get going now, dear. I told her I loved her, then departed through the gathering of worshippers, all of them laid out so absolutely perfectly. Like a chessboard, everyone had their spot, and there was plenty of land to go. So much so that I had to wonder what spots myself, my friends, dad, older brother, and everyone I'd ever loved would potentially occupy one day. En route, I spotted a few other visitors. They looked more morose than I was. They whispered words of affirmation and love to their respective persons, hearing responses, sure, but said responses from the corner of their loved ones' mouths seeming light, quiet, curt, God-centric, like they were standing at someone's gravesite, albeit more a statue than a grave, a commemoration of someone long gone. But no one was really gone. Mom hadn't left. Worship would be over soon, it had to be. Maybe another couple of weeks, couple months at most, and then she'd be home, and the Lord would call someone else to take her place. When thou art in worship, thou shalt not age. Commandment 4 became common knowledge a year later. The amount of folks called to worship had steadily gone up during this time. This was global, of course, so anyone curious could at any time look up a live stream of the designated worship areas around the world to see people standing uniformly, frozen, perfectly spaced. In parks, beaches, city squares, you name it. Every town, every city had its place. My place, I supposed, would be the same field where Mom was, unless it filled up by the time it was my turn, in which case it could very well have been somewhere completely random and unknown. The no-aging revelation was again something discerned by the ever-decreasing amount of practicing scientists on the planet. Outside of worship, life was still progressing normally, more or less, except for that final, tricky death step. Worship grief was a real term now. The experience of losing someone to God, essentially. Not yet coined was the secret counterpart buried in all our brains that, God knows, literally, we weren't brave enough to speak. Worship fear. I tried my best to keep my thoughts pure. I couldn't help but assume that thoughts of blasphemy, contained within the 17 or so centimeters of my brain, were fair game for our omnipotent ruler to scrutinize. It was a nice fantasy, though, the idea that there might be a spot, a street corner without God's CCTV camera. Somewhere you could just be you, without fear that your insubordination would expedite the ticket to your special place on God's canvas. Support groups existed, and so I joined one, and that's where the no-aging element of worship was first pitched to me as one of the many pros of the whole construction. I didn't find Commandment 4 comforting, but I smiled and nodded nonetheless. The world was still the world, but less so. I'd take the train to work and notice that the average of people's expressions had gone from tired and cranky to subtly mortified. I once saw a woman break down and start crying, and I can almost swear she said under her breath, "I don't want to go." Or maybe I was just projecting. Nightmares weren't the same anymore. The worst dream I could have now wasn't one where I was being chased by a murderer or caught in a storm. Rather, the one where I would stop in place while I was doing something mundane. I would hear a voice in my head. The voice would say, "You have been summoned." My feet would start walking on their own, and I'd know exactly where I was going, even if I didn't know where it was. I'd jolt awake in my bed, sweating, praying, funny as it were, that I still had executive function. That, and the little moments where I'd feel a random twitch or spasm in my leg. Those were the killers. And then 4 years passed, and it must have been close to 30% of the global population then in worship. My dad, an unfortunate addition to that communion. My brother and I never got a chance to see him exit stage left into the crowd. The day that he was called upon, he was out and about. I believe he'd gone to see the mechanic, and maybe had a physio appointment on the docket afterwards too. That didn't matter now. We held out hope until the third day of him being gone. The field where Mom stood was full now, and at this point our city had quite a few landmarks for congregation. My brother and I took turns visiting these different areas to see if we could maybe catch our dad standing amongst the crowd. No luck. Around then, I started coming around to what the 5th commandment might have been. Again, this was just me spitballing, but getting any sense of rules or structure during this time was oddly a place of comfort. It was nice to know what, if any, parameters there were to this. It was a redundant rule, really, as I'm sure you'll understand once I spell it out clearly. The thought came to me when I'd see people standing atop high-rises, right close to the edge, as if they were about to leap. And then they'd just turn around. Or when I'd spot people on the bridge, walking alongside the cars, albeit robotically. And I'd wonder if I was just being a cynic, or if maybe some of the pedestrians strolling alongside traffic had originally arrived with ulterior motives. With my brother's mistake, it all became clear. I walked into his room one day to catch him sitting at his desk, a gun pressed to his temple, his hand trembling, the barrel shaking, finger resting on the trigger. I froze in place, and I'll admit, I had the following thought. Please, please, God, let the bullet pass through his skull. Let him die. Instead, the gun fell to the ground. His hand ceased quaking. He stood up from his chair, walked to his closet, grabbed his coat, put it on. "Marcus?" I asked. "Just gonna head out," he said. "To worship," he said, matter-of-factly. "I've been called upon." He headed for the front door. I trailed. "Marcus," I said again. He ignored me. Listen, I'm only asking out of curiosity." I tried not to sign my own release form with my words. "Are you able to control your body at all? Even a little bit?" "No, and I am going to worship." "You can't even—" "If you were feeling the call, it would be clear to you too. And now I need to go." He grabbed his shoes. I walked him the whole way there, 5 hours, until he took his spot in the cleared-out parking lot of a now-defunct amusement park, alongside thousands of men, women, and children. He didn't say anything to me on the trek there, though to be fair, I didn't say much to him either. "If thou attempt to take thine own life, you guessed it, thou shalt immediately be summoned to worship." Gallows humor. The world coped with gallows humor. 70% of the world, after all, give or take, was in the worship state now. I tried my best not to think about it. Standing still, head turned towards the sky, body frozen for weeks, months, or, in the case of my mom and dad, years on end. It was selfish, but I would struggle to visit my mother. When I did go, it would be for a quick side hug, a quick "I love you," and then a hasty exit. I would always wish that she were in a deep trance state, too out of it to return the greeting, but she was instead consistently lucid. "Love you too, sweetheart," she'd say, way too presently. It made me uncomfortable. To be that awake, that aware of what was going on, I didn't like it. The headcanon I was trying to run with was that worship would be a blissful, effortless, dreamlike state. All of the evidence was to the contrary. To God's credit, it seemed like we could talk about worship fear quite openly. Certainly, all of the support groups, online communities, and such were reflecting a different, more honest state for man. YouTube videos and TikTok clips talking about a surefire way to escape. Tactics to reality shift out of this timeline to another. Deep states of meditation that would allow you to pass peacefully without being summoned to one of God's many gathering grounds. And of course, all too many video essays scrutinizing the Lord, complaining about the state of things, calling for revolution, madness, really. There were 2 moments that stuck with me. Moments that really captured the spirit of things. The first was the final video of that guy who was planning an elaborate Rube Goldberg-esque escape from his physical body. Doused himself and his room in gasoline, held a string tied to a blade suspended above his head, had a timer with an explosion counting down. I commended the hell out of his effort. The moment hit, he tossed a match from his seat to the corner. Flames ignited, he pulled the string, and then the fire fizzled as soon as it reached him. The blade froze in midair. The explosion never happened. Thank goodness, really, as the camera footage eventually discovered and uploaded was gold. And then our friend got up from his seat, still dripping and flammable, and walked out of frame. Commandment 5, my friend. Commandment 5. The other was the video of that big streamer who kept faking that he'd been summoned while live on Twitch. His face would go blank. He'd get up from his seat, and he'd mechanically step out of his room. He'd done the fake out so many times that when it was the real thing, chat was in denial for hours. Hilariously horrifying. People still worked, still clung to routine, but it was pretty fruitless. I'd see street preachers with a megaphone, telling us that our time was soon, like, no shit, my guy. Apple, despite most of their workforce having clocked out permanently, still managed to come out with new products somehow. Streaming was mainly reruns, however. Probably hard to commit to a full season of material when your director, lead actor, lead writer, and everyone else on set could step out at a moment's notice and never come back. Less workers everywhere you went. But hey, it made sense. Less customers and all. I picked up a coffee from the Starbucks in my area that still had employees and went off to see my brother. It had been 2 years. His was the hardest one for me. After all, I knew deep down he wouldn't have wanted me to pity him. But holy shit, did I. I returned to the parking lot. It was much busier with people now, at capacity it seemed. I maneuvered the gaps and finally got to him. "Hey," I said. "Hi," he said. "How is it?" I saw his chest expand and contract with his steady breaths. Head lifted, eyes angled up. "How is it?" I asked again. "I'm in worship," he said. "And it'll probably be my time soon too," I said. "Help me prepare." Again, he said nothing. "Bro," I said. It took him a while to finally speak. "You know," he said, "the thought I think about the most is that some random bullet could be flying around somehow. Just a random bullet, fired from hundreds of miles away. And it gets past God's radar. And it catches me in the back of the head. And it all goes black for me. It's my favorite thought. It's the dream that's keeping me going." I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. There's a feeling in my chest. A sureness. This isn't going to stop. I felt trapped. It's going to go on for eternity. No heat death. Just this. I put my hand on his shoulder. An empty gesture, really. I think I just needed something to help keep me upright. "Please, find a way to kill me," he said. And then I had to go. I think I heard him say, "Please stay, I need conversation." Or maybe I imagined it. Or maybe I heard it bang on clear, but I didn't want to think about it because it made me feel like shit. Survivorship bias is a really strange feeling to have when you're still on the sinking Titanic. Sure, your section of the ship isn't submerged yet, but you would be there soon enough with Leo and the gang. Whoever was keeping track had stopped counting. Almost everyone was gone. It was dumb luck, pure and simple. Dumb luck that I hadn't been called upon yet. My soft research started the moment Dad disappeared, but you can be damn sure it escalated after the conversation with my brother. I approached everything with an open mind and tried anything I could. Specific meditations, incantations, prayers to the Lord for the global worship session to end. I went to specific coordinates and towns where, rumor had it, people could actually die. My trips were immeasurably disappointing. No death to be found anywhere. The old constants, death and taxes. The new constants, immortality and worship. I was en route to my 80th or so desperate attempt to find salvation. See, annihilation. A picture of a flyer that was shared to one of the many "Holy shit, we need to die ASAP" groups I was a part of, detailed the church that one Reverend Lucian Ferrer was practicing at. He made lofty promises about his support group that I was sure he wouldn't be able to deliver on, the bottom of the flyer reading much like a pyramid scheme. Join a community with a surefire solution to worship fear. No testimonials because we have a 100% success rate. Come and see the miracle for yourself. But, hey, desperate times and all that nonsense. I made the 4-hour drive, on the way spotting some of the many new landmarks of people gathered, perfectly spaced apart, facing the same direction. Heads slanted upwards, locked in perpetual admiration for the Lord. It felt like my time was closing in, like I'd stop the car any moment now, step out, walk along the side of the road until I reached my place. I arrived at the destination. The church looked desolate from the outside, looked long abandoned. No clue what Reverend Lucian was running here, but hey, if it was just a prank, he got me. I stepped inside and then I felt it. The lack of the feeling of the Lord in my chest. It felt like my bond with the Creator had been severed. By the entrance, there was a table with a sign-in form and a pen. I scribbled my name and the time. The interior stretched quite long. I took a seat in the pews. There were a few others seated in the rows. They looked like they'd been waiting for quite some time. After a little while, a man came out on the stage. "Just gonna be a couple more hours, but he should be seeing to all of you soon," he said. It felt like I was at the doctor's office for an appointment. He didn't reappear for quite some time as promised. Time stood still. I heard the tick, tick, tick of the clock, my hands on my legs. Don't move involuntarily. Don't move involuntarily. He came out, called someone else's name. Thomas Gilmore? Is Thomas Gilmore here? And sure enough, Thomas got up from his seat and followed the man to the back. Tick, tick, tick. Eve Merritt? Eve? That's me. Her hand shot up. That's me. And off she went to the back. Tick, tick, tick. I really, truly didn't know how much time I had left. "It just says Lily here," he said, eyeing the sheet. "Lily?" "She's just in the bathroom," another stranger said. "All right, we'll take her when she's back." And then the sun was going down. How long would this support session run for? I couldn't wait for them to close up shop for the evening. I couldn't come back tomorrow. I couldn't wait. I couldn't fucking... All right. Got a Jake Miller here? Jake? Me, I shouted. Immediately, I stood from my seat. I had the horrific thought that my body would turn itself around. I'd leave the church and walk right into the sunset. But instead, my footsteps made their way up the aisle, and then I was standing right in front of him. "To the back," he said, and I followed him there, a rather confusing and twisting pathway past closed doors, boxes, mess, and hallways until we got there. To a confessional booth. "In there?" I asked him. "In there," he said. I entered the booth. There was blood on the seat. Blood. What a novel sight. "Take a seat, don't worry about the dried. You know, it's fine. You'll be good." "Sit," said who I presumed was the priest sitting on the other side of the partition. I did as he requested. "Reverend Lucian?" I asked. It took him a second to respond, to register. "Ah, yeah, yes. Reverend Lucian, sure." I continued. "I haven't really done this confessional thing before, but I guess, are you supposed to ask me to confess something?" "Yes. Please confess whatever is on your mind." I took a second to gather my thoughts. "Right, yes, so..." I heard the sound of something being cleaned by a cloth, followed by a deliberate, echoing snap. Was he eating? "Right, so I saw your ad, found your ad, rather, and, yeah, I suffer from worship fear, I guess. I don't want to, commit blasphemy against the Lord or anything, but..." I heard the echo of another bite. Jesus, a little rude man. "But, yeah, not sure if I want to stand in a field for 100 years in, worship, I guess." "So not 100 years," he said, chewing loudly. "It's forever. Eternity." That was his little project. His little what now? Heaven on earth. Eternity. That was always the plan. For all of you to become one with the Lord for the rest of time. Of course he wanted to show up when there was the most people, right? He said, crunching. Like, probably. He stifled a laugh. Probably less exciting when it's fucking cavemen, right? Billions of people? Or 10,000 cavemen? Which would you choose? I'm sorry. What does this have to do with anything? Nothing. Sorry. Please continue. Right, I said, gathering. And, no. I guess that was it. It said, you have a surefire solution? On your ad? Yeah, he said. I can kill you. You can kill me? Yeah. Right here. Right now. Course, if you need time to think about it, it's a no. And if you step out of the church, God will summon you right then and there to be a part of the flock. That's... What? How would you know that? What's your answer? There are people waiting, and I'm a busy guy. Busy, Reverend. The answer would be yes, but that'd be in violation of Commandment 3. Sorry, I guess. You don't know what that is. Basically, I've been trying to keep track of everything, and Commandment 3 is my shorthand for the whole, if you try to... Suddenly, the partition fell. Swiftly came the knife into my jugular. I couldn't believe it. Blood spilled onto my shirt, my legs. I gagged, my vision blurring as I tried to focus on the man who delivered the blow. The man who had a bloody knife in one hand, half-eaten apple in the other. The Lord and I have an agreement, he said. He has his space, and I have mine. Albeit, this one is much smaller than what I'm used to. I felt my head lower involuntarily. My eyes acclimated to the final shot, myself drenched in red. You're welcome, I think I heard him say, and then it all went black. A miracle.